Up until this point in the class, we've been using cash flows to implicitly model the dividends that get paid out to shareholders. In certain cases, it might make sense to model these dividends explicitly. And so in this figure here, we have dividends being paid out to shareholders at different periods of time. And so these dividends are going to be a function of various different accounting variables. At the very bottom of this figure, we have the book value per share. The book value per share is defined to be the company's total assets minus liabilities. And so it's also known as the book value of equity. Next to the book value per share, we have the return on equity, ROE. ROE is defined as the earnings or profits generated by this company per dollar of book value. And so essentially, it's a measure of how efficiently this company is generating earnings for its shareholders. And so with these earnings, the company can do one of two things. It can either decide to pay some of these earnings out in the form of dividends to its shareholders. And so P here represents the payout ratio, the fraction of these earnings that are getting paid out in the form of dividends. On the other hand, it can decide to retain some of these earnings and plow that back into the operations of the company. And so B here is the plowback ratio, and it's equal to 1 minus the payout ratio. And so these earnings that get plowed back into the company will grow the book value of the company. And the book value of the company is going to grow at a rate G. And G is going to be equal to the return on equity times this plowback ratio. So G is equal to ROE times B. And now, if the return on equity and the payout ratio and plowback ratio stay constant over time, then everything in this figure is going to grow at the same rate, G, including dividends. And so if the dividends are growing at this constant rate G, then we're going to be able to estimate the share price of this company by using our growing perpetuity formula applied to these dividends. So let's see how we can do that in this example. In our example, we have a company that increases its plowback ratio from 0% to 50%. And so in the case where they're plowing back 50% of their earnings back into the company, the growth rate of these dividends, because ROE and the payout ratio is going to stay constant over time, the growth rate is going to be equal to ROE, which we're told is 12% per year, so 0.12, times the plowback ratio. And the plowback ratio is 0.5. And so the growth rate of these dividends is going to be 6% per year. And so now we can apply our growing perpetuity formula to estimate the share price of this company. So the price of this company, P, is going to be equal to the dividends per share paid out in time period 1 divided by the cost of capital, R, which is 10%, minus this growth rate, 6%, G. And note that the dividends per share in period 1 is going to be equal to the earnings per share in period 1, which is forecasted to be $1 per share, times the payout ratio, which is 1 minus the plowback ratio, so 0.5. So this is equal to 0.5 times $1 divided by the cost of capital, 0.1, minus the growth rate, G, 0.06. And so if we multiply this all out together and compute the price of this company, we find that the estimate of the price is $12.50. Now let's see what our framework would tell us that the price of this company would be under the scenario where they don't plow anything back into the company and they pay everything out, all their earnings out, in the form of dividends. In this case, the growth rate G is equal to, again, ROE, 12%, times 0, because the plowback ratio is 0. And so the growth rate is 0%. And intuitively, they aren't plowing back any earnings into the company to grow the company. And so the price of the company in this case, P, capital P, is going to, again, can be modeled by this equation, the growing perpetuity formula, divided by the cost of capital minus the growth rate, where the growth rate is now going to be 0, and the dividends per share is going to be equal to the earnings per share because they pay it all out in the form of dividends. And so this is going to be equal to $1 divided by 0.1. So this is equal to $10. So intuitively, why did the price of this company increase when the plowback ratio increased from 0% to 50%? Well, if you look at it, the return on equity of this company is 12%. And this is a measure of how efficiently the company is generating profits for its shareholders. And this ROE is greater than its cost of capital, which is 10%. And so shareholders will be more than happy if this company retains some of its earnings and plows it back into these very profitable operations and opportunities. And so that brings us to the concept of the present value of growth opportunities. And so the present value of growth opportunities is defined as the share price of the company minus what the share price would be under a no growth policy, where they aren't plowing anything back into the company. And so in this case, the present value of growth opportunities would be equal to $12.50 minus $10, which is equal to $2.50. And so in general, for early stage biotech companies, which don't have any real earnings yet, the majority of their share price is going to be due to these growth opportunities. On the other hand, for large, well-established pharmaceutical companies, we would expect that a much smaller fraction of their share price would be due to these growth opportunities.